Hey guys, Matt here today, and today I'm just going to do a quick video on Israel and the kings with emphasis on Solomon. Someone asked me if I would talk about Solomon briefly, so I'm going to. And if we think in terms of kings, if we're going to take a macro look, we need to start in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the second law, or Moses re-preaching the entire story of Israel thus far before Israel goes into the promised land. And Moses prophesies about Israel wanting a king. And it's interesting. He starts in verse 14 of Deuteronomy 17. And Moses says this to Israel: "When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it, and you dwell in it, then you will say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me." Well, this is actually interesting because Israel's not supposed to want to be like all the nations around her. Israel is supposed to be a nation of priests, a holy nation, a nation of kings, a nation that's set apart. Exodus 19, 5 and 6. But God knows better. God knows Israel's heart, and God's doing something behind the scenes, as He does all the time. He goes on in verse 15, "You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose, one from among your brothers." He's got to be a Jew. Actually, if you were to follow that thought through, he's got to be from the tribe of Judah, right? That's what a Jew originally was. You've got to be from the tribe of Judah. You can't be from, Benjamin or another tribe. We'll look at that in a moment. So, he must be a brother. "You shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord your God has said to you, you shall never return that way again." Don't go back to Egypt. Don't worry about acquiring a lot of horses. Egypt represents sin. Verse 17, and he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excess gold or silver. Seems to be a protection for the king. When the perfect king comes, he's not going to acquire many wives. He's not going to acquire much gold and silver. He's not going to acquire horses. He's going to be different. He's going to be a special king. Verse 18, and when he, the perfect king, that's what this is talking about, the prototypical perfect king, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life. Why? That he may learn it. And learn to do what? Learn to fear Yahweh his God. By doing what? By keeping all the words of this law and these statutes, and by doing them. And by doing them. That his heart may not be lifted above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right or to the left, so he may continue in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. So here's what God is doing through Moses. He's setting up a definition of the perfect king. The perfect king. He's not going to acquire many horses. He's not going to acquire many wives, lest his heart be turned aside. In fact, he's not going to acquire much gold or silver. In fact, he's going to write for himself a copy of this law. And he's going to meditate on it. And he's going to do it. Now, right away, if you know anything about Old Testament history, you're going to know that no one does that. Less one. Less Jesus. Jesus is the perfect king. So we know that going into it if you've studied your Bible. The perfect king is Jesus, because all the other kings fail. And you might say, well, when did Jesus write for himself a copy of the book of the law? How do we see that? Where does it say that? Well, it doesn't say that he didn't either, does it? But the only account we have for Jesus' life as a youth is when he's 12 and his parents leave him behind. God's plan, sovereign plan. And what is Jesus doing? He's talking to the priests. He's asking questions. I don't think he's asking questions because he doesn't know the answer. I think he's most likely quizzing them. Because he knows the law, because he writes the law down and he meditates the law. When Jesus is in the desert, proving that he's the Israel, fulfilling or succeeding in everything Israel failed at, what does Satan tempt him with? He tempts him with lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. And how does Jesus pass the test? By quoting the law. Deuteronomy 6 and Deuteronomy 8. So, here's the prophecy of the perfect king. Now we know Israel's going to go through a period. She's going to go into the promised land. She's not going to obey, just like Adam. She's going to have one command, just like Adam. And as corporate Adam, she's going to fail. Achan's going to take the bait. Achan's going to take the silver and the gold and the change of clothes. All showing that this next generation, they're no better than the one who perished in the desert. What do they need? Well, they must need some judges. So we'll give them judges. God gives them judges. And they do well and then they fail. And they do well and they fail. And the book of Judges is called the Canaanization of Israel, showing that Israel does not drive out her enemies. Canaanites representing God's enemies. Israel doesn't have a king and she does what is right in her own eyes. Right? Just like anybody does when they don't have the king. So then we get to the book of Kings. Actually, you get to 2 Samuel. 1 Samuel, they get a king. They get a king, and this first king, his name is Saul. And how do they pick the king? God kind of gives them a king after their heart, right? His name is Saul. He's tall. His daddy's rich, and he's good looking. Sounds like a great king. Only one problem. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. He's not even from the right tribe. So he's a terrible king. He's got to be. He's not the right one. Then we get David. David becomes king. And David has something prophesied to him in 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 through 18. David wants to build a house for Yahweh. He wants to build a house for his father. And God says, "You're not going to build a house for me, David. I'll build a house for you." In verse 12 of chapter 7 of 2 Samuel, he says, "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body. And I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." And we know Solomon comes after him, but Solomon's kingdom isn't established forever. Verse 14, "I will be to him a father, he shall to be me a son. He shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rods of men, with the stripes of the Son of Man." Well, wait a minute. If this is about Jesus, Jesus doesn't commit sins. So what's he talking about? He's speaking prophetic language. He's talking about the time when this king, this perfect king, this Jesus, will take the sins of man as his own and give man his righteousness. Man who has faith in him. Verse 15, "But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever." So he prophesies something about one who will come after him, and he's going to build a house. Well, we come to the end of David's life. David dies. Adonijah in 1 Kings tries to steal the kingship away, the kingdom away. Not going to happen. God's sovereign plan is in place. Solomon is anointed king. And Solomon does something remarkable. Remember Solomon when he falls asleep and he has a dream and God asks him what he wants and he prays for wisdom and God's impressed, apparently. And not only does he give him wisdom, but he gives him riches beyond what we could even measure. But it's an interesting thing that happens with Solomon. Before that remarkable dream that we all love to talk about, that we all think about, something happens. 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. That doesn't sound right, does it? He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were sacrificing, listen to this now, at the high places however, because no house had yet been built in the name of the Lord. There was no temple. And it goes on, verse 3, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. Before anything prominent happens to Solomon in terms of his relationship with God, he's worshiping false gods. So as a reader who knows we're looking for the right king, we're looking for the perfect king, we're looking for the Deuteronomy 17 king, we're looking for the blessed man who's talked about in Psalm 1, we're looking for the guy who's not going to worship other gods, he's not going to take many brides, especially brides from other countries that would turn his heart away. Right away he's doing that. He takes a bride and he's worshiping at the high places. Then he has his dream, and then God gives him wisdom and riches, and people come from all around and stand in line to hear the wisdom of this king, right? Kind of like people coming from all over to hear the wisdom of another king who's coming, the perfect king. You get to 1 Kings chapter 4 verse 20, and something important happens. You hear covenant language. Now whenever I'm reading my Old Testament and I hear covenant language and I hear things like peace and prosperity and dominion, my ears should perk up. Whenever I hear terms like sands of the sea or stars of the sky, that should remind me of the Abrahamic covenant, my ears should perk up. God's telling us something here. Chapter 4 verse 20, Solomon's wealth and wisdom. Judah and Israel were as many as the sands by the sea. He goes on to describe how fruitful they were. Verse 24 of chapter 4. For Solomon had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates, from Tipshah to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates, and he had peace on all sides around him. He's got peace. He's got dominion. I could have great hope if I didn't know any better, but I do know better. He already started worshiping other gods. He already started worshiping at the high places. This isn't going to go good. Verse 17 of chapter 5, at the king's command, they quarried out great costly stones in order to lay the foundation of the house and dress with stones. Solomon is building the temple. He's laying the foundation with great costly stones, which is pointing to the temple, which his foundation is described in Revelation. All these hints pointing to the king, but it's not this one. We'll find out why in a minute. We already know why. So Solomon builds the temple, sacrifices in the temple. Things seem to be going well. And you get to chapter 9. You get to chapter 10. And the Queen of Sheba comes. In chapter 9 it talks about... well, we'll skip chapter 9. We'll go to chapter 10. Chapter 10, the Queen of Sheba comes because she wants to see this man who's got so much wisdom. Chapter 10, verse 1, now the Queen of Sheba heard the fame of Solomon concerning the name of Yahweh. She came to test him with hard questions. She came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels bearing spices, very much gold and precious stones. She's coming with great gifts. Kind of like some wise men that we're going to hear about later in the New Covenant. Wise men who bring gifts to the king. This is all just a little picture, a little type and shadow pointing to the king. Skip ahead, chapter 10, verse 14. Very, very, very interesting verse. Chapter 10, verse 14. So we know that we've got a definition of the perfect king, right? We know that we're seeing all of these types and shadows that sound like he might be the one, except for that verse that talked about worshiping at the high places. We've got a king who's got wisdom so great that people travel all around the world to get to him. And they give him precious gifts, right? He's rich beyond measure. He builds the temple of the Lord, like 2 Samuel prophesied. He is wealthy. He's a very prosperous king. Very striking verse in chapter 10, verse 14. Now, talks about Solomon's wealth, and it says, now, the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents. 666 talents. Now, we know that this king's not supposed to acquire much gold, right? Is it just coincidence that there just happens to be 666 talents? And in Revelation, we talk about this number 666. Here's what John says in Revelation. Revelation 13, verse 11. Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to the earth in front of people. And by the signs that is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on the earth. The earth dwellers are deceived by this beast. Now this word beast is important. The beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived, verse 15, and it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. God's going to allow Christians to be slain. It's happening now. They can't be killed spiritually, but they can be killed physically. That's another story. Verse 16, also it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that one can buy or sell, that no one rather can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is the name of the beast or the number of its name. Now here's the important part. This calls for wisdom. John is saying, what I'm going to tell you next calls for wisdom. The entire book of Revelation is a highly symbolic book. It's all true, but it's all symbolism. John says that in verse 1. The things that I do, I will show you concerning Jesus. He's symbolizing. So when we think that there's going to be a beast with 2 horns, doesn't mean there's going to be a beast with literal 2 horns. This calls for wisdom. Let one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for its number is the number of man. This is what I want to talk about in Solomon. The number is the number of man. A more literal translation might sound like this. The number is the number of humanity. And the number is 666. People always wonder, is there going to be a literal stamp on people, and is the number 666 going to be marked? And that's not what it means. The number 666, to have the mark of the beast, just means the mark of humanity. It means the mark of man who worships himself, who worships gold and horses and women and whatever else. The number of humanity is 666. What's the perfect number of God? The perfect number is 7, right? 7 is the number of perfection, the number of completeness. What is 6? 6 is a number that is just a little bit short. You could even say you could triple it to emphasize the fact. That's what John is doing in Revelation. And there is no coincidence that Solomon just happens to get 666 talents of gold annually. Some people might say, whoa, that's over-spiritualizing, which I always think is kind of a funny comment. Over-spiritualizing a highly spiritual book, a supernatural book. What's God showing us with Solomon acquiring 666 talents? Simply this. Solomon isn't going to trust in Yahweh. Solomon's going to trust in himself. Solomon's going to trust in the number of the beast, which is the number of humanity, which is, I'm not going to trust in God, I'm going to trust in the world. That's it. The beast is always referred to as man rejecting God. You think of King Nebuchadnezzar. He looks out over his kingdom and he says, look at what I have. And as he's basking in his own glory, before you know it, God says, you're going to become a beast. The beast is always representing those who don't trust in God. 666 is the number of humanity, the number of man who doesn't trust in God. So it's no coincidence that Solomon is acquiring all these wives and acquiring all this gold and acquiring all these horses, because Solomon is going to turn away from Yahweh. Solomon is not the king we're waiting for. Solomon is not the Deuteronomy 17 king. Even though in verse 10 it says, chapter 10, verse 23, thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. And the whole earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear wisdom which God has put in his mind. Every one of them brought his present, articles of silver and gold and garments, myrrh and spices, horses and mules, so much year by year. They're all coming to Solomon, and the only picture of Christ here is that's what's going to happen in Christ. They're going to come and present gold and incense and myrrh and frankincense because he's the perfect king. This is just a type and a shadow. How do we know? For certain, chapter 11. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women. There's a strike. Along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations concerning which Yahweh had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods, which is exactly what happens to Solomon. Solomon clung to these women in love. He had 700 wives. Man, that's exhausting. Princes and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father. David's heart wasn't wholly true. David was, what that's saying is, David was faithful. David was faithful because God allowed him to be faithful. Verse 5, for Solomon went after the Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place, and it goes on and on and on, and he worships other gods. So here's the picture. Moses prophesies about the perfect king. And that perfect king isn't Saul. And that perfect king isn't David. And that perfect king isn't Solomon. What are they waiting for? They're waiting for the perfect king who will actually do something no other king did. You see, Israel without a king did what was right in her own eyes, and with a king, she followed her king. You'll see all these kings, and even a couple that were relatively good, but they always had a fundamental flaw. They did not tear down the high places. They allowed the worship of other gods. Furthermore, they died, they were born in sin, and they couldn't get Israel to follow in God's footprints, in God's obedience. The king failed and caused Israel to sin. The moral of the story is, without a king, she does what she wants. With a king, she follows the king. What does she need? She needs the perfect king. She needs the Deuteronomy 17 king. The king who's going to write the copy of the law, know the copy of the law, meditate on the copy of the law, Psalm 1, and do it. The king who's going to follow the law so well that he never sins and he actually fulfills it, Matthew 5. The king that does something else. The king that does this. I will sprinkle clean water on you. This is the perfect king. And you shall be clean from all your uncleanness. And from all your idols I will cleanse you. No other king could do that. And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh, and I will give you a heart of flesh. I'm going to give you a new heart. No king could do that except for Jesus. And the creme de la creme of the perfect king, what does he do? Verse 27, Ezekiel 36. And I will put my spirit within you, and I will cause you to walk in my statutes and to be careful to obey my rules. The perfect king comes, and it's Jesus. And he doesn't just wash away sin. He doesn't just die on the cross. He doesn't just give people eternal life. He actually comes and lives inside them and does what no other king could. He causes them to walk in his ways. No king, people do what's right in their own eyes. Bad king, people do what's right in that king's eyes. Good king, people do what's right in his eyes because he gives them a new heart and lives inside of them. That's the overall synopsis of Israel and the kings, and it all points to the perfect king, King Jesus. Peace.